Hello, BookTube. All right, we're going to continue on with these Q&As. There's quite a few pages. I'm going to try and do these in 3 videos. So let's try and get through this next page of questions with dispatch, so if that's possible for me. So Patrick Kenny asks to name top 5 living historians or biographers and top 5 dead ones. This is almost impossible as a question, but I tried it anyway. The 5 living would be Jill Lepore, Susan Jacoby, Margaret Macmillan, Diarmaid MacCulloch, and Andrew Roberts. Those are 5 living, but there are many others. And 5 dead, of course, there are many of these, but Samuel Eliot Morison, Bruce Catton, William Hickling Prescott, the Venerable Bede, and Livy. But again, many others. PRCZEK02 asks, a good TV series on the American Civil War. There is nothing better than Ken Burns' The Civil War. If you haven't seen it, you should find it and watch it. And if you have seen it, watch it again, because trust me, it is just as good the second, third, fourth, or fifth time as it was the first time. It's amazing. And a movie dealing with American history that Europeans definitely shouldn't miss. That would be, for me, would be To Kill a Mockingbird. Definitely watch it, or rewatch it. Link Joker asks my thoughts on book abridgments. I don't like them at all. You're either in for a penny or you're in for a pound. Keep in mind that is not the same thing as a series abridgment. Something like Samuel Eliot Morison, who wrote a 20-something volume history of the U.S. Navy in World War II. His 1-volume abridgment of that series, Two Ocean War, is very, very good. And we've seen on this channel, there are many other examples of that. But abridging a book, one book, no, I'd rather not. Thanks. He also asked thoughts on non-Elric Eternal Champion novels. This is a real specialist question. Elric, Michael Moorcock wrote a series of novels starring an albino sorcerer named Elric of Melniboné, and Moorcock is important to understand here. He's nuts. Okay, all right. He's got no fencing on his back pasture, if you know what I mean. And he conceived Elric as being just one iteration of this thing called the Eternal Champion that shows up in different iterations, in different time periods, in different planets and whatnot. I don't like the concept at all. I mean, the books, Michael Moorcock, as far as I know, never wrote a bad book. So the books are all readable. The Quorum books and all that sort of stuff, they're all readable. But the idea itself drives me nuts. The idea itself is just ridiculous. So I'm kind of mixed. This is still Link Joker. Is Superman a harder character to write than, say, Batman or Spider-Man? Yes, he is, absolutely. Because unlike Batman, he does not have a fixed mania as a ready source of drama. And unlike Spider-Man, he's not a down-on-his-luck everyman. And unlike both Batman and Spider-Man, it's almost impossible to give him a serious challenge, physically. Which is the natural go-to and very lazy way that writers come up with challenges at all, is that it must be a physical challenge. So he's harder in those ways, and also, he's a nice guy. He's a noble guy. He cares about what's right. It's tough to dramatize that if you're a poor or lazy writer. It's not that. It can be done, and it can be done on a regular monthly basis for decades. There were writers who did 2 Superman comics every month, and they didn't go on coke benders, and they didn't whine about it at conventions, and they didn't gripe about it on social media. They just did it, and those adventures are still worth rereading. But he is tougher. Yeah, I would say one of the toughest superheroes. His counterpart in Marvel, Thor, is also, in my opinion, very hard to write, because he's a mythological character who's been around for thousands of years. And if you write to that, you do just fine, but then he never goes to Earth. Which is, in Marvel, that's kind of not the way you want to do things. And if he goes to Earth, then all of a sudden you've got a glaring contradiction. Why on earth would this being do that? Why would he care if Stiltman is robbing a bank? Why would he call on the help of the Avengers when he's easily more powerful than all of them put together? But Superman, yes. See, it's digressions like that are going to kill us. I'm waving my finger at you, even though it's me making the digressions. Let's see here. He also asked, or they also asked, did any manga grab your interest after reading that big Thames and Hudson book that we saw on manga? Quite a few of them did. I was Wikipediaing and Google image searching a ton of stuff from that book. It is a treasure trove. I highly recommend that those of you who are manga fans really can't miss it. And the last question from Link Joker is, which massive pivotal historical event do you lack any interest in reading about? It used to be that there were a handful. For instance, the endless national and civil wars in post-colonial Africa, or the Crusades. It used to be that sometimes that would be the case, but I've increasingly found that the more I learn about them, and the more varied approaches that I read in the books that I get, the more interested I am in them. So there might not be any subject. It might just be bad luck. And then we move on. Jere, Jere, says, is there a recent feminist utopia novel that I would recommend? No. What is my opinion on Jack London and James Oliver Curwood? And I'm assuming from the mention of Curwood here that your question is, what is my opinion of people who write books from animals' points of view? And I usually find them ridiculous because they're human points of view. I am not the right person to read such novels because I am better aware of an actual animal's point of view than virtually any other person that goes on two legs. Maybe me and Jane Goodall, maybe. but the more aware you are of the viewpoint of a non-human species, the more ridiculous such books seem. And I guess that's inevitable. So that part of what do I think of them? It's never been much to me at all. I have to look around that in their books. What I think about them otherwise is a much bigger story, because there's a good reason why we don't read Curtis or Curwood, and we do read London. And it has nothing to do with literary merit. If you, like, for instance, you mentioned in your video that you just finished Grizzly King by Curwood. I'd be willing to bet. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'd be willing to bet that if you read Grizzly King back to back with White Fang, you would not notice a qualitative difference. And that is entirely accurate. And why we remember London and we don't remember any of his contemporaries who wrote in the exact same vein has a lot to do with media and market manipulation, and very little to do with literary quality. Gier also asked, European comics like Asterix, Tintin, Valerian, do I like them? He's never heard me mention them. And I don't usually mention them. I like them just fine. But as the questioner suspects, my heart lies with superheroes. Now, in the question, Gier asked, does my heart lie with superheroes who get their powers from radioactivity? I want to stress, I'm a DC fan, not a Marvel fan. Yes, in the opening years of Marvel Comics, Stan Lee had everybody get their powers from radiation, except Thor and Doctor Strange. But DC wasn't like that at all. DC heroes tend to be born with their powers, and I'm a big fan of DC. I was, long before I was a fan of Marvel. And Gier also asked, any recommendations for books on the Kessler syndrome? And for those of you who maybe don't know what that is the idea that Earth is right now surrounded by orbiting garbage. Everything that goes up must come down. These orbits decay, and the Earth is surrounded. It's like a mosquito swarm. The ambulances never rest, even on Sunday. Even on Sunday, the town right across the border has people setting their Afghans on fire by accident. But anyway, if you've ever seen video footage of like those patches on the ocean that are just floating islands of garbage, or waves coming in that are just waves of plastic garbage that are just slopping onto the beach where you can barely see water, that is what Earth's immediate atmosphere looks like. Take a really good telescope out into a dark night sky, you'll see what I mean. But the Kessler syndrome is, what would it take to cause a chain reaction that would cause a lot of that to just basically rain down, to start like a billiard ball chain reaction that would cause a lot of that stuff to fall out of the sky. And what do I think of the idea is that, of course, I think it's legitimate. And it could certainly happen. And as far as a book on the subject, I don't know if I've ever read a nonfiction book on the subject. There really ought to be a really good one. Probably there is one that I've missed. And it was a big part of one of Neil Stephenson's tomes, Seven Eves. It was a big part of that, was what happens if Earth's immediate atmosphere becomes hostile. So I'm not sure that I'd recommend Seven Eves, but that was definitely in that book. Let's see here. View from the bar. asks, what about the idea of a big novel? What does it do to the psyche of a novelist? Is it something writers should strive for? Does it damage them, etc., etc.? He makes mention in his video, in his question, of the fact of my own connection to a big novel, because there reached a point. I write novels for fun. You've never read any of them, but unless there are two of you who've read a couple of them. But I write novels for fun, and there was a time years ago when I thought, I want to try that. I want to see what it's like to write a 1,000-page novel, and I did. And it was a blast. It was an absolute blast, but it was mind-bogglingly hard to do. And I don't know. I mean, the gist of the question to me seems to be: is there any actual merit in such a book, either for the reader or for the writer? For the writer, there might be. For the reader, I've almost never read a book that long that warranted it. The ones that do warrant it in spades, but most of the ones that I've read, like for instance the aforementioned Neil Stephenson, likes to write books that big, and they never warrant the space. I'm okay with a book being 1,000 pages long if I never get the sense that the author is going for that. If I get the sense at any point that the author is going for length, then the author is doing something wrong. And if I can sense that, so can a lot of other people. So I am sometimes tempted to write another big book, to write another gigantic novel. I am sometimes still tempted to do that, but I've so far mercifully refused. Let's see. Okay, PRCZEKO2 comes back with another question. What is it that makes biography your favorite genre? I love it because it's genuine drama. It's not contrived drama. It can't be contrived drama. Instead, it's genuine. It has troughs and peaks, and it intersects with the real world in a way that in historical fiction would by necessity be contrived and therefore feel manipulative. For me, not to mention the fact that people are always interesting, right? People are interesting to people. So there are a number of different factors, but I think mainly the fact that it's genuine drama. When a biography is exciting you, when you're starting to wonder what happens next, even when you already know, well, that's a fantastic feeling. And this person also asks, can you think of people whose biographies should have been written but haven't yet? I want to stress here that it's not always just a question of someone whose biography should have been written already. It's that biography is a self-renewing genre. There are new viewpoints, new perspectives, new generations, new documents, sometimes new interpretation of old documents. So it's not just a question of, are there people who've never had a big definitive biography, but where is the new one? Why am I reading 4 biographies of Hitler and Napoleon every year and not any new biographies of X, Y, and Z? So if you keep that in mind, I want to list a few people. Just off the top of my head, I wrote them down. The Holy Roman Empress, Maria Theresa, held sway over thousands and thousands of people. It was an interesting person on her own and was a key figure in her period. Where is the big biography every year? Where is the big biography this year? 1,000 pages on her. What I wouldn't give for that. Also, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. has a new biography about every 5 years, maybe every 10 years. They're all really good, and they all have really good parts on his equally famous father, but where's the big book on him? Just him, and maybe his Boston. The literary Boston of his day. Where is that? I would love to see it. Esther Forbes, a lot of you will know her as the author of Johnny Tremaine. She also wrote biographies in history. She led a fascinating life. I don't think she's ever had a biography. Madame Curie has had a couple of biographies, but they are way too often in conjunction with the men in her life. Where's the big, huge biography on her own? Let's see here. Pablo de Sarasate, the great violinist. A fascinating story of backwater beginnings to world renown. I don't think I've ever read a major biography of him. Certainly nothing in the last... No, I don't think I've ever read a major biography of Sarasate. Even in Spanish, I don't think I have. And also, what about the Roman Emperor Caracalla? A lot of you will be familiar with his famous iconic bust, the marble statue of his face, but what about a big life of him, a standalone life of him? Not 10 people on the left and the right of him, but just him. And when you think about that, how many Roman emperors are lacking that? How many U.S. presidents are lacking that? So, I don't know what it is. The biography school for British monarchs seems to get that it's not just a question of whether or not George I was all that interesting on its own. It's that you can use that as the linchpin for the life and times, which is why we have reams and reams, whole buildings full of great books that do exactly that for the British monarchy. Where is it for the rest? Where is it for the rest? Where are those in English, for instance, for the Spanish monarchy? Or for the Doges of Venice? Anyway, let's move on. Let's see here. Abirami P.S. asks, when did you get into reading and what kept you going? I came to reading late. I had one particular teacher who got past my defenses and past my objections, and I can't thank him enough, and showed me that reading was wonderful. And that wonder has kept me going. And what do you think is the point of reading fiction? Well, there are some days where I would answer this with, there isn't one, or it beats me. But no, like the rest of you, I have read fiction, plenty of fiction, that just made my hair stand up, that just moved me right out of myself. Fiction can do that as well as anything else can. So, like with any other genre that I read, the point of reading fiction for me is constantly hunting for that feeling. I'll take what I can get. I'll certainly, consider any kind of book, even if it doesn't do that. But I'm hunting for the same thing we all are, which is to be just completely electrically lifted up out of your skin by a book. And I don't care what kind of a book it is if it does that. Dan J asks, what are your thoughts on Marguerite Young, whose book Macintosh My Darling is hardly ever mentioned on BookTube? And have you read her unfinished biography of Eugene Debs? I have not read her biography of Eugene Debs, but I love Miss Macintosh My Darling. I think it's fantastic. I wish it did get mentioned on BookTube. And again, I will reread it when some publisher decides to reprint it and sends me that reprint. I know that will happen. You know it will. Sometime in the next 5 years, for sure it will. Considering her biography and considering the nature of the novel, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already. Let's see here. Mary Tumulty asked, during your time in Washington, D.C., were you writing for a publication, a think tank, as a staffer for an elected or appointed official, or as an employee in one of those huge government agencies? And I don't know whether you're psychic or not, but during your time in Washington, let's go over it again. During your time in Washington, D.C., were you writing for a publication, a think tank, as a staffer for an elected or appointed official, or as an employee in one of those huge government agencies? And believe it or not, my answer is yes. If you'd mentioned anything else, I would have had to qualify, but no, you hit them all. Derek Green says, what is your favorite Victorian-era novel? Middlemarch by George Eliot. Amtrak Jack 42 says, if you opened a used bookstore, what would you call it? I would not under any circumstances open a used bookstore. John Ball says, what do you think of Douglas Hofstadter's Gödel Escher Bach? It's a trippy book. Those of you who haven't read it maybe have heard about it. It's a trippy book. It's meant to be trippy. It's meant to be read while you are tripping. I thought it was nonsense. Just almost incomprehensible nonsense from beginning to end, and I hate to say it, but most of the author's other books as well. I have written scathingly of this author in print and online, and I think it's all just, he's one of those, hey man, this is wild authors that they're so in love with their own teenage sense of wonderment that they've just continued to perpetuate it, and it gets faker and faker with every decade. And there is such a thing as an adult wonderment. It's not that wow, I remember when my mind was blown. That's not the only kind of wonderment there is. It's in fact the simplest kind. So that's a digression. And once again, I'm pointing at you, even though I'm doing the digression. So in answer to your question, I don't like Gödel Escher Bach at all. Let's see here. Peter Prablo says, why don't you like W.G. Sebald? And I've never mentioned Javier Maurice, and I used to dislike Sebald because I read a whole bunch of his books and thought that they were thin and scattershot. I recently, just I think a year ago, I reread Austerlitz and liked it a lot more, and I was partially helped in that regard by the previous owner of the hardcover that I got. I noticed when I got the hardcover that it was full of clippings, New York Times book review of Austerlitz, a couple of essays by other authors on this author, the New York Times obituary, and I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? Somebody really used this as a storehouse for all the stuff they clipped on Sebald, like I do with my own books. But it turns out that person did more than that. They also annotated as they were going along, and I was helped enormously. I felt like I was in good company for that book. So I ended up liking it a lot more than I think I would have. So I guess I'm moderately open to reading the rest of his stuff, but I'm not going to buy it. It's going to, like I said in the rest of these questions, somebody will reprint, say, well, it will come to me, and then I will try it all. Let's see here. Derek Green asks, what East Asian classics would you recommend to somebody interested in Western classics? No offense meant here to my Eastern Asian brethren, but I would suggest that somebody who's interested in Western classics should bloody well read them. Instead of dabbling in one or two and saying, I'm ready to go on the road like Kwai Chang Kang and Kung Fu. I want to read something that's not usual. It's not on my ordinary palate. You don't get to call it an ordinary palate until you've read the books. Okay? So read the Western classics until you know them. They're your patronymy. Read them until you know them instead of, I want to open my mind, man. I'm sick of being part of the patriarchy. Read your Thomas Mann, have you? Read all of Jane Austen, have you? Read Macaulay? Read Hume? Anyway, someone named William asks for my opinions of Francis Parkman. I love him, absolutely love him. He never did anything wrong. I think his books are fantastic. Thomas Carlyle, very, very much like. George Bernard Shaw, I very much like him, but you're going to be able to see this coming. I love his book writing more than I do his drama. It's huge. I used to have a huge volume of his collected book prefaces, essays, reviews, that sort of thing. I don't know why I let go of that volume. I probably sent it to somebody, but I love that more than I do his essays or his cod philosophy or even his drama. I know it's shameful to say about his drama, but what can I say? I wish I still had that volume of his. Frank Conroy. William mentions that it just occurred to him that Conroy taught at Iowa and therefore wonders if I ever met him. I did meet him. Yeah. And I like his work quite a bit. And also James Baldwin. And James Baldwin, of course, his work I really like. I think I liked it right from the beginning. And then he also asked for a good biography of Robert Morris. There was one just a little while ago. I'm trying to remember the name of the author. It wasn't all that good. I think that's why I don't remember the name of the author. Morris still needs a gigantic, really great biography, something that isn't just factual but pulls in the reader. And as far as I know, he hasn't had that. Also, James Otis, another a figure from the American Revolutionary period, who has never had that kind of biography. Never. 250 years later. Never. Also, Thurgood Marshall. I liked Juan Williams' book. I've read a couple of Thurgood Marshall biographies, and Juan Williams, I think, is the one that I really liked. In fact, I'm sure of it, yes. But although there were parts of it that I thought were weak. So I don't know that I've read a great Thurgood Marshall biography. If any of you have, and you want to recommend one, let me know. And also Benedict Arnold, and for that it would be a very recent book. It would be Joyce Lee Malcolm's book, The Tragedy of Benedict Arnold, which I think came out last year, and which I thought was superb. So that would be very recent. Then the Room Note asks, how often do you reread a book right after finishing it? It virtually never happens. I virtually never do that. Parts, maybe. The introduction, if it's a work of nonfiction, maybe, but not just sit down and reread the book. Why I don't know why I would do that. My recall for what I read is pretty good, and there's always other books to read. And Several Gecko asks, is there any modern music that you enjoy? To which I give my standard answer: all John Philip Sousa, all the time. I wonder if we can get in another page. Can we get in another page so that this isn't 50 videos? Let's try another page. David Waldrop says, do you like the poetry of Robert Burns? I certainly do. Minnie Gunnifer asked, do you prefer the Brothers Karamazov or the Idiot? The Brothers Karamazov, even though it's bloated. They're both bloated, but Brothers Karamazov is bloated in a way that I really like. So, Sophia Tomic asks, is there a dog breed I don't particularly like? That would be heresy, wouldn't it? It's like asking a parent which of their kids they don't like. I love all my babies. There are a couple of dog breeds that seem to me to have been bred into problems. Some of the really small, really overbred breeds, like for instance Pekinese, I've almost never met a Pekingese that had a good temperament. if I'm meeting a dog, I try to meet them just as an ordinary person, not as their king. So I try to meet them just like you would on the sidewalk. And if that meeting is instantly savagely vicious, if I need to assert who I am to a dog, if I need to take a step back and say, all right, how about you reconsider, because it's not just an ordinary human here, and then they look sort of confused, almost like I've hit them with something, and then they are friendly. If I have to do that, then there's something wrong with that dog, right? In a way, there's something wrong with that dog. And I've seen that in some of the inbred smaller breeds, and also in, I hate to say it, Dalmatians. I've almost never met a Dalmatian with a really good temperament, where I didn't have to make my presence known, as it were, in order to get a civil response. But that doesn't mean I don't like them. That's just, I worry about them for dog owners. Let's see here. Carlos asks, Ian McEwan or Julian Barnes? I think both of them, I hate to say this, but I think both of them are basically C-list authors who've been just jumped up because I guess they were marketable or continue to produce works every year or whatever. But if I had to choose, Ian McEwan probably would be better than Julian Barnes. And he also asked Roger Federer or Rafael Nadal. And in terms of watchable tennis, they're androids. Neither one of them does watchable tennis. They will do, in any given moment of any given set, they will do what is physically possible to the absolute last decimal point of what is physically perfect. They're androids. There's no sense of individual play. There's no sense of style. So in terms of preference, I would have to use non-tennis parameters, if you know what I mean. And for non-tennis parameters, it would be Rafael Nadal rather easily. Derek Green, as favorite all-time novelization of a movie. I have tried to make this point before. No one ever believes me. No one ever does. I'm asking you only to test it for yourself. And that is Hank Searles' novelization of Jaws 2. Now, Jaws 2 is a fantastic movie. People don't give it the credit that it deserves. I love it. I think it's great. I think it holds up to multiple reviewings. But even though it does, it's still Brody dealing with another shark, and that seems a little thin, dramatically. It seems totally contrived. So you might think that a novelization of that would be even worse. All I want you to do is test it. That's all. If you don't believe me and you're at least bit inclined, find a cheap copy of the novelization of Jaws 2. Watch the movie, and then read the novel. That's all weekend for you. See if you don't agree with me. I bet you will. The novelization is much better than the movie, and much better than it needed to be in order to get sold. Hank Searles was a hack of the first water. All he needed to do was finish his contract, and he knew that. And he still made the book very good. Much better than it should have been. So that's an old rant of mine. Paper Mache says, top picks for books about espionage, etc., spies, that information gathering, that sort of thing, either be it nonfiction or fiction. This is a starter kit on its own. But for now, for nonfiction, I would pick Anthony Cave Brown's Bodyguard of Lies. It's an oldie but a goodie. Very good on intelligence work. And for fiction, for me, it would be my favorite John le Carré, which is The Perfect Spy. And let's see here. We'll try and get through this. Oh my, we're going on here. Scott Tippin says, would you make a video of your favorite vegetarian meals? That would be even more boring than my usual videos. Lambie asks, video or videos dedicated to travel stories. Talk about boring. You people want to hear my moose story, I'm sure, and my baboon story. But I assure you, most of it is just me reading. Jack B says, why are you so interested in William Howard Taft? Again, this is a whole video. One of the things that I like most about him is that he did not have ambition to be president. He was not the kind of megalomaniac who thinks that they should be president, which in his own day was incredibly rare, and of course, obviously, it's still rare. His ambitions always lied elsewhere. And also, just his nature. I think he was much smarter than he's given credit, much sharper than he was given credit, much funnier than he was given credit. I just find him fascinating. I found him, like everybody else in the world in his own day and since, I found him through Theodore Roosevelt. And the contrasts were originally what interested me between those two men. But then he started interest on his own. Jack Riley says, the best book so far on the Obama administration. He admits that it's early days. That is true. I've heard rumors of 2 Obama presidency books that are coming down the pike, one in 2020 and one in 2021. I'm looking forward to both of those. But for right now, for me, it would be Ben Rhodes' book, The World as It Is, which is not at all meant to be a comprehensive stand back history, because Rhodes was there for it all. But in terms of a book that captures the spirit of the place, the spirit of the times, the frustrations, the joys, I would pick his book. I really think it's worth your time to read. And also he asks, if I'm coming to America, what city do I recommend? Boston, New York, or Washington, D.C.? I, of course, recommend Boston. And you must come to the Brattle Bookshop with me. Let's see here. Highbury says, would you ever consider doing a starter kit on books about books? I certainly would. Yes, I should long since have done it. N. Paris says, do you currently follow any serialized stories or have any favorites? I do. I follow way too many to list in an answer or even in a whole video, and that is because I am still, to this day, in love with fanfiction.net. It's a website totally, it's a garden of amateur writing. It's all devoted to fan fiction, which is a problematic kind of writing on its own. You really can't get a book contract writing fan fiction, except in very rare instances. And you usually have to jump through legal hoops. So fanfiction.net is very informal. There's not meant to be any kind of legal claim to anything. And all these writers are just, they're operating out of love. I have written many, many things for fanfiction.net under many pseudonyms. And I've also read tons, hundreds, maybe thousands of stories. And some of them are ongoing. On all sorts of different, you go to fanfiction.net, you'll see what I mean. There are fanfictions of poems, albums, books, of every genre, movies, TV shows especially, just a million things for you to read. They're wonderful. Most of it's garbage, but there's quite a bit of it that isn't. So well worth an exploratory hour. JPD Manchester says, what is your criteria for what books that I get in the mail that I keep? And that it changes, but right now that criteria is extremely strict. It's it's not just a question of do I like the book, it's that it has to fill a need. It has to be something that I feel like I'm going to keep forever. So I keep very few of the books that I get. In the past, I have had much broader parameters, like if I like it, or if I thought it was really good, or if I thought it was really noteworthy. Those are not good reasons to keep a book. Revisitability, for me now, is the key to keeping a book. Otherwise, I'd be up to my eyeballs in them. I practically am already. JPD Manchester also asked, what book, despite high expectations, disappointed you the most? I try not to get my expectations up. Sometimes it happens. Like, for instance, but usually not followed by disappointment, so much as just self-criticism. I heard about the bandwagon for Karl Ove Knausgaard's books, his series of wretched autofiction, for instance, long before I read the first one. And I kind of got my hopes up that it would be a major, important work, and it most certainly was not. I, of course, like everybody else, have my hopes up for the next Hilary Mantel, Thomas Cromwell novel. What if it stinks? That won't be good. And also, JPD Manchester finishes up with 5 living authors with whom you'd like to have dinner, and I wrote them down. First one is Bernard Bailyn. Second is James Mustich, the author of 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die. The third would be Doris Kearns Goodwin, if she can squeeze me in. The fourth would be Susan Jacoby, and the fifth would be Tony Dokuquil, who's a name that you might recognize. The others, you might not recognize his name, but he wrote a fantastic book called The Last Pirate about his father. It is well worth your time to read. It is a terrific read, not just sons and fathers, but also as a portrait of an era. And also has a bit of a connection to me, you could say. He has a bit of a connection to me. He was the first editor in the modern era. Remember, I was, those of you who might not know the story, I was a book reviewer forever and ever, and an arts editor forever and ever. Then I stopped for a quarter of a century and was a bookseller. And then, about 15 years ago, I got back into book reviewing, and he was the first editor to run a piece of mine. And was encouraging about that, so you have him to blame. But anyway, that is this next one. This is getting too long, so I'm going to stop. We still have more questions to do, but I think we can finish this in one more video. So that'd be 3 videos. So I'm gonna wrap this up, and I'll be right back. Thank you, BookTube.